Welcome to the inaugural episode of Inside the Internet Garage. It's an Inc. at NYU production here at New York University. I am exceptionally pleased to welcome two of the Internet's great chroniclers, people who know all the stories. They've been covering the web since it got started. In one of their cases, before there was a web. So it's wonderful to have with us today AllThingsD founders, Swisher and Walt Mossberg. So thank you so much for coming. So you have this unbelievable story of actually going on the very first time you engaged with a professional journalist in Washington. Turned out to be a quite significant internet executive.
It was huge.
But at the time, he's editing the Metro section.
The Metro editor.
What happened?
So I was covering an event that someone at the Washington Post also covered, and they had college coverage from time to time because there's lots of colleges in the Washington area. And so I was covering the exact same event, but the Washington Post piece was full of errors, and it upset me like horribly. I was sort of mad at the Washington Post because I had such great regard for the Washington Post. And so I called up the Washington Post and I said, I want to speak to someone about this article. And at the time they would answer you, they would actually answer you. And so I got on the phone with this guy and he's like, well, what do you want? And I said, you suck. Like, you suck. How could you do this? How could it be full of errors? It has misspellings. This is not what was said. The quotes are wrong. I'm so disappointed. And now I question everything about the entire Washington Post. And so I went on, and he said, why don't you come down here and say that to my face? And I said, fine, I'll say it to your face. And so I got on a bus, the M2 or M3 bus, and went down to the Post at 15th Street and L Street. I walked in, and it was Larry Kramer, who later founded MarketWatch. And he was the Metro editor, and he was, and he thought, I wanted to meet the most obnoxious call I've gotten all week, kind of the person. And so I kept saying, how could you do this? How could you have such bad standards? How could you suck so badly, essentially? And he hired me to cover colleges on the spot, essentially. So he hired me to cover Georgetown. And I spent most of my time not being at but covering Georgetown, but doing articles for the Washington Post. And I worked there as a copy aide and things like that.
So there was a long journalistic career prior to tech.
Right.
And I think there's this assumption that like you've been covering tech your whole life when in fact that's not the case. That said, you are going to have to talk about your tech stories. Even in this photograph, which, by the way, the lamb chops are
nice.
I know.
Out of control.
I miss those. Yeah.
So
I have them in a drawer at home.
Around this point, you're starting to use technology. Maybe a little later. I don't know exactly the year of the photograph, but you're getting plugged into technology long before personal technology launches.
I took it up as a hobby more than 10 years before I started the column, and it absolutely shaped my view of what I wanted to do with the column and the proposal I made to the journal, because I was essentially a hobbyist. I learned to code, which meant learning BASIC at the time, and I had several computers that I couldn't afford.
All of this happening while you're covering the State Department, covering the Pentagon.
That's exactly right. And that one is important because that's the year that I made the switch, 91.
So literally you're booking thousands of hours in your study at home. There's no computers at the office per se.
No, you're doing. There were some computers by then.
But like your internet life, and is happening out of your house and your.
Well, it wasn't the internet. It was CompuServe and AOL and so forth.
All right.
And I decided there was and people who knew, and this still happens, I think, although less, because you've got to remember the world had large numbers, probably a majority of people who didn't really know how to use a computer or anything digital. Even if they had it at work, they had like a specific program and they just learned to type a few commands into some database, and that was it.
So this is what happens. This is you with Baker, and you have a pretty amazing story about then Secretary of State Jim Baker. This is the column you write. This is the last column we can find prior to the launch of personal technology.
Actually, the columns I write now in the journal were not the first. I was a columnist at the journal on other topics before.
Right. So you're writing, look, it's really unbelievable. You have these quite powerful, inside the Beltway beats. For Washingtonians in the room, Walt was a real player in journalism, which is, really the only other profession after politics in these days.
This was the beat to have. This was really the.
I was the national security correspondent.
So he gives this up. You give this up to, and here's the very first column as it appeared in the journal in those days. I don't know who this guy is. Is that Perlstein, or like who is that guy?
No, they hired an illustrator to do.
That was for a long time. You had
Right.
the
Now I want to, if you'll indulge me, this
greatest line ever.
this and Kara, you have some very specific feelings about this, but I thought we might try something here. I was hoping we could all say this line together. Does it look okay up on the slides? Because I don't think you've ever heard like a large group of people
All right, if you
say it. So I'd like to try this. All right. Now I'm not a
Yeah.
conductor. We'll start on 3. I know it's a little bizarre,
I
but I
wrote
wanted
it
to try
hoping
it.
a cult would be formed
Yes,
around
exactly.
it someday, so.
Thank you. This is like kind of a, let's call it a religious
Kafka won't
moment.
say it. I know
I know.
this
This
right
is
now.
this is your life, Walt Mossberg. So on 3, 1, 2, 3. Personal computers are just too hard to use, and it's not your fault. Wow. Let's come back to Kara a little bit.
You know, one of the things I was trying to do with these articles was, and when I moved into business reporting, it was the same thing. Jargon, same thing. And business is about emotion. I was a big fan of Dallas, for example. It's about emotion, money, humanity, fighting, and all kinds of things. I looked at it that way versus a thing, and so I was always trying to get to the point of it. I was always trying to find ways in that the reader would understand.
And you did that as you went over to the business press.
Yes,
I
that's very
love this. To me, is kind of
was a
vintage
good lead.
Kara Swisher is such a great lead.
That's a good lead.
And for those of you who can't see, G.I. Joe landed on Boardwalk yesterday. That's so a way to talk about.
I don't remember that at all.
A way to talk about a merger. So you're now covering business. We're now in 1991. You're covering business. You're writing about technology, and you both have these very important experiences
Right.
with this company.
They kept sending us discs, so we couldn't not pay attention.
Right, exactly. Long before they were sending discs.
And we both got to know the woman who sent the disc, by the way.
Right,
Yeah.
right. She's unfortunately not here
Jan
with
Brandt.
us today. Like, if
Jan
this were
Brandt.
truly This Is
Jan
Your
Brandt.
Life, I would unveil her right
Right.
now.
A
Please
marketing
don't.
genius.
She's crazy.
You, long before the discs came out, you wrote a column about AOL.
Well, the discs were around when I wrote the column.
Yeah, but not like
not
in
in
the
big
yeah.
profusion. So here's my part of the AOL story, and Kara has a much more significant part. But in the back of my mind, thinking about, because I'd been on CompuServe for so long, and I had tried out Prodigy, and my own company, Dow Jones, had a thing called Dow Jones. I can't even remember what the hell it was called.
I don't know.
It was like
I don't even.
I don't know, but it had a service. So, and I was allowed to criticize my company's stuff, which a lot of newspapers you couldn't do that. But in the quality, the New York Times or then the Washington Post, even now, you can criticize advertisers or whatever. Anyway, I, in the back of my mind, thought about doing a column. But meanwhile, I was getting these calls from this little company in the DC area, which is where I happen to be based. Because when I started my tech column, I refused to move to Silicon Valley on grounds that it would dull my ability to think like an average consumer. I would go there and meet people and do reporting, but I always would write from the perspective of, and in many ways, DC is not a normal place, but in terms of tech usage, it's just like every place else that's not within 25 miles of Palo Alto. So I stayed in Washington, and AOL was this little company in Washington. Now, I knew their service, so I had a Mac, and they were particularly good on a Mac.
Why'd you write the column in such a positive way?
Well, because, first of all, they got me out there by constantly calling me. And since I had this other idea in the back of my head, I thought, well, maybe I'll include them, and they're like a half an hour. They were behind a car dealership in a little industrial park near,
Vienna,
anybody
Virginia.
know what Tyson's Corner is? So they were in that vicinity in Virginia. And
They were across the street from Texas.
I sat waiting to interview Steve Case. And it was such a small company that I could see him in his Hawaiian shirt in his office through the door of the lobby. And, I actually wrote a column, I think it was in early '92, in which
he gives you a lot of credit for putting the
should.
company on the map.
I said, this is the online service you, my reader, should be using because it fits in with the graphical user interface. They used the graphical user interface on the Mac, and on PCs, they didn't have a Windows version at the time, but they had a version in GeoWorks, which was kind of an alternate interface for DOS that mimicked what we think of as Windows. So it was easy to use. CompuServe was all text. Prodigy was
Stupid.
like one-way, you're stupid. It took over your whole computer.
That was actually a good lead. I said Prodigy is everything Sears knows about technology and everything IBM knows about retail.
Right.
So
that's exactly right. And
that is an exceptional.
Prodigy didn't even want you to do email.
yeah, a lot of celebrity focus.
So I wrote this column at the time. Prodigy and CompuServe each had, I'm maybe remembering this wrong, but they each had a couple of million people, which was quite a lot in those days. AOL had 200,000 people,
Right.
and I wrote this column. I think it was the first national article recommending them. And the head of Prodigy marched into the Journal within a week and demanded they fire me. And it was kind of the first test of me as a critic, like a movie critic, but of technology.
So it's a very important, it's also one of the first times you had a massive impact on a company. Certainly not the last time you had a massive impact on a company. We'll talk about some more of those in a second.